Today we're going to be reviewing two EPs that were packaged together in the UK as one by Alice in Chains. So this is my review of Jar of Flies and Sap. Let's get ready to rock. Welcome back to Rocker's Beer Review. Today we're doing another rock review. This time we're still on the theme of grunge music, so I decided I wanted to review an album by Alice in Chains. This is actually a sort of EP called Jar of Flies. It's a 7-track, but I'm also going to include the review for Sap in this because although released at a different time and actually before Jar of Flies, in the UK they were both packaged together as a sort of double EP in one package. So it makes sense that there's a lot of people, certainly my UK audience, probably would have, if they've got these albums, they've probably got them together. So Sap was recorded and released in 92, A Jar of Flies came out in 94. But they're both, they're both part of the same, they both have the same sort of theme. They're all very acoustic in their nature. So I'm going to refer to this as the Jar of Flies album to begin with. I mean, I bought this. This was probably my first grunge album that I actually bought. And I can actually quite, even though it was, what we're talking about, 26 years ago when it came out in terms of this package, I can remember it quite clearly because I was living in Glasgow at the time, in Scotland, and I remember, not really being into grunge music. A lot of my friends had got into it, but for me, I was still sort of in the hard rock and heavy metal sort of, that was the stuff I was still into, and I was a little bit sort of hesitant to get into grunge really, but I saw this album. I must have read something about it in Kerrang, and I thought, yep, laid back, it's just something that I wanted at the time. So saw it in the shops, saw it in HMV at the time, this is how much we're going back, and just thought, yep, I'm going to pick that up and listen to it and enjoy it in the sort of, a bit more laid back and acoustic. So Alice in Chains were quite big when Jar of Flies was released. They'd just come off the Dirt tour, their big sort of their big album, big breakthrough album, and they wanted to return to the studio soon after being on tour for that album with their new band member, ex-Ozzy Osbourne bass player Mike Inez. Mike Starr had been sacked whilst on the tour because of his over reliance on drugs, but it would be nearly a year later till I really sort of got into the likes of Soundgarden, Pearl Jam and Stone Temple Pilots. But as I said, this was my introduction to grunge music. So they went into the studio with no songs written, and they wanted to do something a bit more laid back. They'd been playing it pretty loud on a big tour, and they wanted to go into the studio and actually write and record at the same time with a much more sort of laid back acoustic sound. The result of this was not only one of their best records that they put out, but in my opinion, one of the best records of the grunge era. The album starts with quite a laid-back song. I mean, it's quite laid back all the way through, but the Rotten Apple, the first song, sort of sets the scene, really. It's a 7-minute, very melancholic, almost an epic acoustic song, and that sets the scene to the whole album. Second track is Nutshell. It continues, but it's probably the standout track of the record. It drips with sadness. It sort of really brings home, really, when you think that, Lane Stanley and his premature death, and his voice in this is so warm and so impactful. And, I think it's probably, again, one of his best vocal performances. It's got real haunting backing vocals. And although it's still heavily acoustic, there's some really excellent guitar playing and soloing by Jerry Cantrell. The third track, I Stay Away, picks up the pace with a little bit more. It starts off quite light before erupts into a more grungy sort of sound reminiscent of the tracks from Dirt, but still with very uplifting chorus and lots of sort of strings, and again a real great fabulous guitar solo. 4 is called No Excuses, and we continue the sort of more upbeat but still a little bit more, but still acoustic. There's a bit more sort of jangly guitars, and there's a real sort of odd drum sort of beat, but it's quite accessible. Great sing-along chorus and great solo. And this song really shows how much Jerry Cantrell's voice is a real big part of the Alice in Chains sound, because he's actually singing lead on this. Then we go into a slight change with Whale and Wasp. It's an interesting sort of instrumental. It's quite moody with a very sort of drony sounding guitar, but with a little soft acoustic all the way through it. It's quite soothing and it's quite different for a grunge band to do an instrumental sort of track. An ultimate track is Don't Follow. It also features Jerry Cantrell on lead vocals and is much more sort of folk sounding, although there's still a lot of acoustic guitars, it's a lot more folky than some of the other tracks on there. There's also a fair little sort of country type of twang to it, where there's like quite a lot of sort of little harmonica solos in it as well. It's a great track though. And then we end with a very sort of, again, a slightly change again. It's still quite laid back, still acoustic, but it's much more sort of jazzy. There's a real sort of swing bass and sort of drums beat, but there's still that grungy sort of undertone with Lane's voice and Jerry's sort of like fuzzy guitar sort of tone real ever present in this album. 7 songs is quite short, but obviously this is an EP, but it doesn't outstay its welcome. Every single track is great. There's no real filler in there. A lot of people might think the instrumental is a bit of a filler, but I think it's a real great instrumental. So Sap is even shorter still. This is the other EP that was released between their first album Facelift and their second Dirt. As I said, in the UK these were packaged together. It's very acoustic, and if anything it's probably even a bit more laid back, but it does include a number of special guests. So the opener song is called Brother. It's written and also sung, lead vocals again sung by Jerry Cantrell, but Lane Stanley provides some really great haunting backing vocals. But also there's a guest on this. It's Ann Wilson from the rock band Heart, so she really gives it another level of edge. Really it's a great song. Got Me Wrong, again, we've got lead vocals split between Jerry and Lane on this. Still very acoustically based, but there's a bit more grungy sort of lead guitar tones in this. But it's really about those harmony vocals between Jerry and Lane Stanley. Right Turn, track 3. Again, very acoustic when it starts, and it's quite soulful. Lane Stanley's got a real soulful voice in this. But then it sort of picks up pace, mainly with the introduction of some additional vocalists. One of them being Chris Cornell from the rock band Soundgarden, and also Mark Arm from Mudhoney. So it's a real sort of, they called it Alice Sound Mudhoney or something. No, Mudgarden. Alice Mudgarden, that's what it was a credit to on this track, because there's all those three. There's Alice in Chains, obviously Lane and Jerry, as well as Chris Cornell and Mark Arm of Mudhoney all singing on this. It's a great track though. Then Am I Inside sort of ends the sort of album. It's very acoustic, very sort of Lane singing very sort of haunting vocals again, and it slowly builds up, and again Ann Wilson from Heart pops up again with some backing vocals on this. It's quite short. There is a lost track in there, which is all a bit of a sort of, it sort of does ruin the mood a little bit, where all the band members are actually all playing different instruments than what they normally would play. But it's a bit interesting, but it sort of does ruin that sort of very sort of laid back, sort of melancholy sort of tone to this little EP. So quite short, but this, if you add the 2 tracks together, it's 11 tracks. It's a nice album. Every song on it is great. It strips the band really, quite down to really show the vocal prowess really of Jerry Cantrell and of course Lane Stanley, and it shows, and it sort of paves the way for a lot of those sort of MTV unplugged sessions. I mean, Alice in Chains, Nirvana, Pearl Jam all had albums which were unplugged by MTV and really show them in their their most sort of haunting, I think. It's a perfect album for winter nights. We're in the winter now. It's a great sort of album for just sitting back and relaxing to. It's also, if you're into grunge music, it's essential in my opinion. Every band should, every fan of grunge music should have it. And if you're not a fan of grunge, you'll get a lot out of this. It's not as grungy as maybe some of those grunge bands. It's acoustic, it's laid back, it's got bits of jazz in it, it's got a bit of country in it, it's got a bit of folk in it. It's good for everyone really. And although I didn't include it in my 10 essential albums, because I think Dirt from Alice in Chains really sort of propelled them onto the sort of, the global stage, it's certainly, in my opinion, probably my favourite Alice in Chains album. So if you haven't listened to it, get onto Spotify and check it out. So I hope you enjoyed this review of Jar of Flies and Sap by Alice in Chains. It's one of my favourite albums of all time. If it's a great grunge album, but you know, in terms of any of the music I listen to this album quite regularly. It's a really great album. Certainly the two EPs are worth your attention. So, hope you enjoyed it, and until the next one, you know what you're going to do. You got to keep on rocking.